Hey, everybody, welcome. It's great to have you here. My name is Dave Taylor. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at a Salt Lake City, Utah-based company, Impartner. We build solutions that enable companies to go to market indirectly through an ecosystem full of partners, referral providers, resellers, distributors, etc., affiliates, alliances. And we are passionate about the topic of how to partner in the best possible way. I'm really excited today to be joined by Kate Vitasek. Kate is a renowned authority on strategic partnerships and what she refers to as the vested business model. And Kate will hear a lot more about vested and what that means. Kate was named one of the fabulous 50+1 influential people by World Trade Magazine. And despite what shows on the shelf behind her, Kate has actually published 7 books, with number 8 coming soon, I think. Is that right?
That's correct.
Including the 2 that I was the most familiar with, Vested and Getting to We. Kate was featured in top media like CNN and Bloomberg and Harvard Business Review. And now Kate leads the Vested program at the University of Tennessee, who I think have a pretty good football season going this year. Is that right?
It is. We are number 7 in the college football rankings. So pop quiz for today. There's only one non-SEC school in the top 7. So pretty cool.
That is, yeah. So Kate's work has really been around inspiring leaders through courses, through keynotes, and she comes from a strong career in the private sector, including roles at P&G, Microsoft, Accenture. Kate at one point founded a consulting firm called Supply Chain Visions, which I believe is still functioning. And we are just really excited to have Kate join us. So Kate, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me and letting me share some of our research and how you can turn this amazing research into practice.
Yeah. Well, we've seen in the market in the last, I guess I would have to say kind of decade, but accelerating in the last few years, a real transition into and investment into the partnering in business. And we believe that there's a high level of strategic conversation that could and should be had behind partnerships. So many people tend to think of them as transactional, but some of the research that you've done and some of the research that you're going to share with us today really, I think, is germane to how to partner better, how to partner more fairly, more equitably, and how ecosystems, the future for ecosystems, we believe, is nothing but primed to disrupt business as usual. We think there's a strong growth for them. So we started this Ecosystem Academy, where we try and go beyond day-to-day kind of tactical deal registrations and market development funds and things like that, to really discuss theories, concepts, research that we believe will shape tomorrow's partnering ecosystems, all with the goal of trying to up-level the role of partners and up-level the role of partner managers and senior executives in companies that go to market through ecosystems. So this is the first of 4 sessions that we'll do. And this one, we're talking about how maintaining a balanced and just environment is crucial for sustaining long-term success. I know we've got 55 minutes left to talk about what we mean by balanced and just. So we'll spend a lot of time on that. But Impartner's belief, and I think echoed by Kate, is that it's crucial for sustaining long-term success is to foster that system of trust with your partners. And Kate, I believe that you're backed not only with your own research, but you've got some Nobel Prize-winning economists in your pocket as well, I think, don't you?
Well, yes, and that's what I want to focus on today, because as a researcher and academic, it's not just your individual research that is important. You really build on the shoulders of the people before you. And so all good innovations, you usually have an idea and it builds on and it builds on and it builds on. And so what I wanted to share today is 5 Nobel Prize winning economist theories and how you can put these theories into practice. And a couple of these folks, we actually embed their theories into our work in teaching strategic partnerships. And in fact, Oliver Hart, who we're going to learn about, won a Nobel Prize in 2016. And he wrote the foreword for my book, Contracting the Economy. And he says, as an economic theorist, theory very rarely meets practice. And in the case of what we teach, it is one of them. And so that's something we work very hard on at the University of Tennessee, especially in the supply chain program, is to take concepts and make them very teachable and very practical. And that's what I'm hoping to share today, is just these amazing ideas. I mean, heck, somebody wins a Nobel Prize. Shouldn't we be paying attention to their research? So how to take these great big ideas and put them into practice.
Yeah. I mean, so we first became kind of, very, very interested in some of Kate's work just because of the concepts that she was talking about. To be honest, I didn't know at the time, but have since learned that there is an awful lot of research to back this up. And I love that because I think a lot of people can have opinions on the subject, and maybe somebody on this call right now is thinking, hey, I've been in partnerships for 20 years. I know all about this. I believe there's always something that we can learn about how to partner better, how to go to market better, how to be more fair and more equitable, and build the relationship of trust with our partners that we really need to. And I love having, it's like, when you see the doctor's office and they've got all their certificates hanging on the wall, the diplomas. This is good because it means there's some real depth and some real research and knowledge behind this. So this is very cool.
Excellent. And Dave, it is back to school season. So why not kick off by going back to school and maybe learning a few things that you might have missed in school?
Yeah. Let's go ahead. Why don't you go ahead and dive in? Let's bring up your very first prize-winning economist.
Excellent. So the first one I want to cover is Ronald Coase. And he sadly passed away a few years ago. But he really set the tone with his research with a concept called transaction cost economics. And actually, there's a lot of researchers that have built on his work. But to put it into practice, I like to use this picture on the right-hand side, which is what I call a priceberg. So we were doing some work with the Department of Defense and the Defense Acquisition University. And so they have a picture, and it's a ship, and he's coming in, and you can see that ship comes in and he hits the tip of the iceberg, and that's the price. But what's below the iceberg, or this priceberg, is all the other costs associated with things. And this is where you get the concept of total cost economics. Price is only the tip of the iceberg, and we have to look beyond price to see how we can create the most value. Because if I'm just looking and say picking a supplier or partner on price, I miss the big picture. And this is something that we find when you put into practice and you're looking and evaluating partnerships and suppliers on total cost of ownership. It opens a whole new window of opportunity for value creation.
I notice in some of the work that we've discussed that Ronald Coase was associated with, I've noticed that the concept of data and analytics plays really heavily in a lot of the work that they've done. Tell me just a little bit about why that's so important. How do organizations such as the people that are listening in, how do they leverage data? What's the role of data in monitoring sort of real-time equity and making sure the partners are feeling the full advantage of the relationship? How does that work?
Well, the data that people have is going to be a source of information to help you make better decisions, right? Especially economic decisions that can improve your top line or your bottom line. So I'm going to give you an example from our Harvard Business Review article, A New Approach to Contracts. We profile a case study from Dell and FedEx. So FedEx had done the returns for Dell. So your Dell computer breaks, you send it in. It doesn't really go to Dell. It goes to a supplier who does that work. And so for many years, they had fought over the cost per box. How much does it cost to, repair this computer? And when they started to look end to end at the supply chain and the data and the analytics, the whole total cost of ownership, the flow of the supply chain, you could start to get a bigger picture for how much it really, reverse logistics cost. So in their relationship with FedEx, they shifted to use the vested methodology. So instead of, just paying a billable line item to repair the computer, right? So many dollars cost per box. They took a step back and said, well, let's look at the total cost of ownership. What's the cost? And by being very transparent, cost is the cost is the cost. Looking beyond the four walls of one partner into the supply chain, you can now begin to optimize. So having the data allows you to get that one, moment of truth where you've got the end-to-end picture. And now you can start to pull on the levers to reduce total cost of ownership. And in the HBR article, we talk about in the first 2 years, they reduced their total cost of ownership by 42%. That's not just a little, that's not like 2% year on year. It is really big chunks of money. So instead of fighting over price, let's collaborate to reduce our total cost of ownership.
Yeah.
Get away from that price. Price bergs are bad. Lots of costs are underneath that price berg.
Yeah. We always see people, we always work with companies who have a sense for what their, for what their price structure is and a sense for how their partners are performing. But we resonate so strongly with that concept behind, data validation and data verification, because it just really puts everything on the table. And if you're trying to establish a relationship of transparency and trust, being really open, with the data and talking about data rather than opinions. Now, so you mentioned a couple times in what you just said, you used the word fight. You said they fought and they fight, and this is not a way to become best friends. This is a way to become good partners. Is that right? How does this work?
Absolutely. I mean, and I use the word fight there, but not everyone's in a fight with their partner, but usually everyone is in a negotiation with their partner. You negotiate, you trade off, you have concessions. And what we should be doing is actually collaborating. What's the end game in mind that we're trying to do? You enter into these strategic partnerships to do something, to create value. And all too often, we enter into this us versus them negotiation or a checkbox. How many things did you sell and what's the percentage that you got? And we're bickering, negotiating instead of really creating value. So we should be creating value and sharing value.
Yeah. Way back, probably before most of you were born, I was in the MBA program and I took a class on negotiation. And they would sit me on one side of the table and my opponent on the other side of the table. And I had a sheet of paper and I was graded on what I accomplished on this sheet, and they were graded on what they accomplished. And, the finals came around and I sat down at the table across from my opponent and I handed him my paper and I said, look, this is what I'm trying to accomplish and this is what I'm being graded on. Can I read yours? And, he gave me his paper and then we read it. We said, it looks like if we do this, that we both win. He said, yeah, I like that. 5 minutes in, we were done and we both got A's. So I like that concept of openness, transparency. Hey, you mentioned a second ago, the vested methodology. Is now an appropriate time for me to ask you to kind of dig in a little bit on that?
Sure.
Good. Dig in a little bit on that.
Okay, perfect. So the vested methodology is really based on our research. We studied really successful deals between 2003 and 2009, and our research was funded by the Air Force and Department of Defense. And one of the things we want to know is what makes these successful relationships super successful. And some themes emerged, and those themes are so important. We actually call them rules. So there's 5 rules to vested. And there's 10 contractual elements. So when you craft a partnership using these rules, by the way, rule number 1 fits into Ronald Coase there, right? Transactions. We need to get off the transaction treadmill and really start to think about business outcomes. What is it we're trying to achieve with our partnership? And from there, once you have your outcomes, now you craft the relationship, the contract, the work, the metrics, the money, the governance. And everything you do should be not being on a transaction treadmill, but instead working together to collaborate to create that value. And so it's really just a methodology. There's 5 rules, 10 elements. People walk through each of the rules and outputs their a contract, right? So instead of negotiating, you're really co-creating a collaborative strategic partnership all the way down to the contractual elements.
Yeah, I'm so intrigued by the 5 rules and the 10 contractual obligations or elements. Maybe in one of our follow-on sessions, we're going to do 4 of these kind of on a 1 per quarter basis. Maybe we dig in a bit more on that in one of the next ones. But for now, we've only done 1 of the 5 Nobel Prize winners. You want to move on to another?
Absolutely. So excellent. So our next Nobel Prize winning economist is Robert Solow. So, and again, all of these economists, they have their entire life study into, what they're doing. And I'm just giving you a small little headline here. But if I'm teaching, why should we pay attention to Robert Solow? And it's because economic wealth is driven by innovation. And businesses today are always talking about innovation. I think it's more of a hot topic today than it has ever been in the history of business. And so Robert Solow looked at how organizations created value, economic wealth. And what he found is there's 4 buckets of ways or levers to create economic value. And those 4 buckets can be split into 2 categories. One is product and process improvement, so ideas. So I call this brains, right? So your brain power. How can we improve our process? How can we improve our products? The other hand is labor and physical capital. Now I call that butts. So you've got brains and butts and buildings, right? Brain power, process and product improvement accounts for 87% of economic wealth.
Wow. So
if you're in a partnership and it's about, can you just go do, labor, labor, physical capital, butts and buildings, we're missing the potential value that we can get from this partnership, because it really comes from the ideas of doing things, processes and products better, faster, cheaper, more sustainable. 87% comes from that brain power.
That's impressive. I do think, and again, the approach that Impartner takes on this does tend to be, despite our best efforts, a bit pragmatic. And as I think about the implications of what you've just said to the businesses that we work with and the ecosystem of partners that they work through, I believe that that's an area that really is underinvested. I think there's a real focus on the butts and not enough on the brains, because because I think many problems can be solved with innovation in process and training in people, and it doesn't always require manual labor. So that's really good. And I love knowing that the path to economic prosperity comes more through the brain than kind of manual labor. So that's really cool.
Yeah, I want to give you an example here of this in practice. So BP outsources their facilities and real estate management. So, a lot of butts, cleaning people to work in the cafeterias, maintenance guys, right? And so you think about a typical outsourcing initiative, it's a lot of times very, labor intensive. A lot of our partnerships have these labor type roles into them. And they still need that labor. So it's not going away. I still need people to clean. I still need people to work in the cafeterias and do maintenance. But in their vested partnership with Jones Lang LaSalle, they took a different look at that and said, well, how can I actually bring out the brain power of all the people around the world? And so they challenged them to not just come to work every day, but to come to work to achieve business outcomes. Remember how we just talked about the first note about Ronald Coase, right? We need to move away from transactions and start to also think about total cost of ownership. So if I'm someone out there who's a janitor and I see a potential way to do better, faster, cheaper, and more sustainable, I want to tap into that workforce to bring those ideas.
Yeah.
And in the first year, they had over 100 innovation ideas that were submitted and implemented by workers. So you can take this source of labor and you can turn them on to brain power, challenge them with brain power. And that's something that's really interesting. And we've been studying that BP relationship. By the way, that's a public case study. Feel free to download it. They from our website at vestedway.com, where we have all of our white papers and case studies, which are open source in the Creative Commons. We've been tracking that relationship and continuing to do it. It's won a Sourcing Industry Group Award. It's up for a Council of Supply Chain Management Innovation Award. And after 3 years, they had 500 innovations. See how that flywheel's going? People are coming to work and saying, hey, this is a pretty cool place to work. I can have an impact. My ideas matter. My brain does matter.
Yeah.
Even though the majority of the work you think, oh, that's just butts, right? That's just labor. Turn that force of labor into a source of innovation.
And they're the ones that are closer to what actually needs to be done. That's where the best ideas come from.
Absolutely. And, you know, and what we're teaching isn't new. It's just sometimes we forget about it. I mean, Toyota made the concept of giving and empowering employees in the line, you know, using Kaizen events. That's something they've been doing since the 1940s. But we often forget to put these great concepts into practice.
Yeah. So, Kate, you and I have spoken in the past about, well, a lot about what Ronald Coase talks about, that the implications of being transaction oriented and the cost of transaction. What would you say to somebody who says, hey, this is all really good, but I can't afford to not be transaction oriented. I have to be transactional. I mean, how would you coach somebody off that ledge?
Well, actually, I would say embrace it. It's just not everything's a transaction. P&G has 80,000 suppliers. Should they all be transactions? You know, yes, we need to have a lot of our relationships very transactional, but we need to be looking at our more strategic partnerships and shifting those up the sourcing continuum where they are not transactional. So segment those partners to ones that really can create value versus exchange value. Value exchange, transactional. Value creation, right, needs to be very different. Outcome-based, we use the term vested. You have a vested interest in your partner's success and you're creating value.
I mean, when you and I first met and talked about this, I think the first thing that I really fell in love with is that concept of vested as a, you know, kind of as a phrase to capture the essence of what, you know, of what a good partnership represents. I really like that, the phrase of vested.
Yeah, and it was interesting. We were bantering around when we were doing our research. Well, what do you call this methodology? And we came up with all these funny names and different things. But at the end of the day, vested just seemed to fit, right? Because a great partnership, you should, you know, have a vested interest in my success. I should have a vested interest in your success. 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. It equals 11, right? Because it really is about value creation.
Yeah. I don't know anybody in business in the space that we work in the technology space, that wouldn't love to have their partners, their strategic partners, have the sense of being vested in a common goal that you work towards together. Everybody wants that, but often don't know how to attain it. You know, the example that you gave a minute ago was interesting to me. You talked about, you know, somebody doing janitorial work. You view employees as partners as well, isn't that right?
Yeah, absolutely. One of our case studies is the Canadian government healthcare, Island Health, with their hospitalist doctors. We actually featured that case study in the Harvard Business Review article as well as in the book Contracting in the New Economy.
Nice. Love it. All right. Hey, we've got 2 Nobel Prize winners down and more to go. Let's keep moving.
Awesome. So let's move on to our third, which is John Nash. Now, you might not remember who Nash is, but I guarantee you the majority of people have heard about Nash through the movie The Beautiful Mind. So that was an amazing movie, won all kinds of awards. Russell Crowe was the actor that portrayed Nash. Now, in the movie, it shows that Nash was schizophrenic, which is a very true story, right? He really was schizophrenic. So his beautiful mind, people discounted because he was a bit, goofy. But he really, really did have a beautiful mind. And he came up with what's known as the Nash equilibrium. And I like to think about this as grow the pie versus fight over the pie. And we've talked a little bit about that. My work around Vested is around value creation and creating partnerships that drive innovation. And so one of the quotes that we have here is the best results come from everyone in the group doing what's best for themselves and the group, right? So 1 + 1, I have these skills, you have these skills, let's put them together and we can actually grow the pie. So he goes on and wins a Nobel Prize as well in 1994. Now, his work spawned an entire area of research around game theory. So this concept of game theory, how do we work and strategize? So think about it this way. We have choices we can make. And so if we want to create a partnership to create value, then we need to work differently.
Yeah. So I don't know. I'm going to say this, and it's a little bit inflammatory. And if people disagree with me, I'll just say right now, you're probably right and I'm probably wrong. But the concept of growing the pie versus fighting over the pie is so intriguing to me, because I really do think that in some ways, the pace of innovation in today's market has slowed because it's all competing over who does this widget better rather than who does big, bold, how can we grow the market? How can we make the world better? How can we provide products and services that are better overall for people and for humanity, rather than I do the best pencil lead. No, I do the best pencil lead, and I'm going to discount it to prove. So I think that I think it probably has had a measurable impact in slowing the pace of innovation in some ways.
Yeah, correct. And this is where we like to think about value creation, right? So go back to the butts and buildings, right? You can take something that was very transactional and you can challenge people or partners to actually not just show up and do the work, but to think differently how they do the work. So it doesn't have to be a big, bold innovation idea. It's not, it doesn't have to be something that's never been done before. I mean, go back to BP, 100 things. Those, I don't care how you create value. It could be 100 little steps or one big step. And so we often chase the big innovation, the sexy, glitzy thing, and we overlook the fact that we could be doing 100 little things. Mm-hmm. And innovation isn't just about a new product. We put in our brains that it's about a new product, but it's process improvement as well, right? How can I improve my sustainability? How can I reduce, a small amount of total cost of ownership? Well, a small step here and a small step there over 2 years for Dell equaled to 42%.
Yeah.
Right? So don't be afraid of the small steps. They add up to often more than a big step.
Yeah. And so much of the work that you do and the way you kind of talk through this has to do with the collaboration rather than competing, collaborating, finding a goal and collaborating on it. Do you, first of all, to do that, you really need a culture of trust and collaboration in order to drive a relationship where where both it's a true win-win. Both partners in the equation, come out ahead. What strategies do you recommend for companies that want to kind of cultivate that culture and ensure this long-term success for the partner communities that they work through?
Well, that's really interesting because we actually do, as part of our research, what's known as a compatibility and trust assessment. And we're taking the cultural footprint of these partnerships. One of the questions in the compatibility and trust assessment is, give me 3 adjectives to describe the relationship that we have with our partner. And I'll turn back to Island Health. When they started, toxic, opaque, really negative culture. And so how do people get that culture? Their behaviors. How do people get a culture that's very positive? Their behaviors. So we want to highlight the fact that your behaviors create that culture. It's a choice to be transparent. It's a choice to not be transparent. It's a choice how you come to work every day and treat your suppliers. In our book, Vested, How P&G, McDonald's, and Microsoft are redefining winning in business relationships, McDonald's case study starts out, McDonald's has a secret sauce to supply chain. It's not their suppliers. It's how they treat their suppliers. And I think that's the magic, is we're having a conscious choice to not only say strategic partnership, but to be strategic partner, all the way down to our contract. In our AP article, we make a joke and we talk about a termination for convenience. Oh, you're so strategic. And I have a 60-day termination for convenience clause. I can fire you just because. Yeah. Really? So we say one thing and then we turn around and do something else. We say you're a strategic partner and then I put you on a transaction treadmill. Yeah. We say you're a strategic partner and then I beat you up on price. And I'm taking away value. We create value and I want to put all the value in my bucket instead of sharing it.
I assume that the concept of transparency starts kind of from the top in organizations. You must consult with people and have kind of ideas around specific tools or maybe processes that you have found to be really effective in kind of fostering that concept of transparency.
Yeah, we use a tool called the Transparency Commitment Matrix. It's crazy simple, right? So just have a piece of paper. We'll even do these virtually. It's amazing, right? So you just do a virtual whiteboard. You put a line down the middle, like a T chart, your company, my company. And then you start to say what you'll be transparent about and what you won't be transparent about.
So transparent around your opaqueness.
Exactly. And so the simple fact of talking about what we'll be transparent about, now it gives you permission to be transparent. But we're always second guessing. Should I share that? I don't know if I can share that. I don't know, right? Why don't we be transparent about what we're going to be transparent about? And if that data, go back to your first point about data and analytics, the more information we share, the more value we can create, right? The saying is, if information is power, well, shared information must be exponential power. We can now do so more when we start to have information across our supply chain, not just within our 4 walls.
But I know business people who feel that information is power, and the more information I keep, the more powerful I become. You're suggesting it's almost the opposite.
Yeah. I wish I had a deck of cards with me. So I'm going to play a mental game with you, Dave, right? So we're going to play
7 of clubs.
Okay. Yes, exactly. So you get 5. Well, I'm going to up the game here because you get 5 cards.
Okay.
You get 5 cards. And so you get 5 cards and I get 5 cards. Each of us have a hand. Well, you can beat me with your hand. I can beat you with mine. But what if it's not about beating our partner? It's about beating the market, beating our competition. Combined, statistically, Dave, we're going to have a higher chance of a better hand together against our competition than we will against each other.
Yeah.
And we don't think about that. And that's exactly the advanced math that Nash used. Set a strategy with your partner, your players in your ecosystem, to beat the competition. And we're not thinking about how we can optimize through collaboration. Instead, information's power, as you said, and I want to withhold, right? I want to beat up you.
Yeah.
And we don't always, I use the word fight and beat up, right? But we don't always have negative relationships. But we do get into these very typical relationships that aren't transparent. They're not creating value. They're just, I win today, you win tomorrow, we win some, we lose some, we win some, we lose some. It's almost like a virtual ping pong match. And it is very taxing. It takes a lot of energy to just go back and forth in transactions. We could replace that ping pong match with collaboration that's going to drive us forward to create value.
Yeah. So a lot of the work that you've done, I think, is much broader than this. But for me personally, in the business world that we operate in, I think of partnerships typically as being a company working with a variety of partners in their ecosystem. But the relationship is not always kind of peer to peer. It's I'm a company. I've got 12 partners. Some of them are strategic alliance partners. Some may be distribution partners. Whatever the case may be. But you would draw the picture as kind of the solar system with the vendor in the middle and all the partners circling around. But the concept of kind of fairness and equity would say that for each of the partners kind of circling your solar system, they're the center of their own solar system with a bunch of vendors circling that. And in any of those relationships, it doesn't take a lot for one of the partners in any of those relationships to be toxic to the relationship. And I see too frequently where that happens. And sometimes it's the company that just doesn't know how to partner well with others. They're very transaction oriented. What's in it for me? Can you put things in my basket? And sometimes it's the partner that they're working with where they say, I'm not going to share the information. I've been talking to your customers and I know what they think, but I'm not going to share that with you because it gives me power. It doesn't take a lot to have one of those become kind of a toxic relationship. Are those savable, salvageable, or do you just kind of cut strings and move on?
Well, let's go back to Island Health, right? In the HBR article, toxic, opaque, bullying. 18 months later, after going through the vested methodology, collaborative, win-win, very different culture. In fact, remember those adjectives that we look at? We do a lot of different quantitative analysis on the compatibility and trust assessment, but it's these adjectives that I really like because they went from 84% negative adjectives to 86% positive adjectives. You absolutely can turn that around. A toxic behavior is a conscious or unconscious choice, right? You get into this slippery slope, tit for tat, downward spiral, and you can undo that, but it is a choice. And when you put that in front of people and you say, all right, well, if we really are strategic partners and we can create value, let's change the underlying way that we work. And that's really what we teach, is the how, because what we teach is radical common sense. Of course we should have win-win deals. That's a good deal, but then we won't do it. And so it's really about putting these theories into practice.
And I would bet that you find in your work that a lot of that toxicity is driven by fear. I think probably fear drives a lot of that.
Well, it is, but also it's just simply not knowing. So go back to transparency, right? Someone doesn't know that they can share, that they should share, so they don't. Or in the past, they've shared something and they got in trouble for sharing. So now they don't want to share anything, right? But being very, having the discussion about transparency, saying, hey, here's, the only thing you can't share are these three things. Everything else is in. It takes out the question. And it builds those relationships. We use a thing called guiding principles. And I'm going to save this for when we get to Oliver Hart, because that's our work with Oliver Hart on formal relational contracts.
Do it. Go move on to Oliver. Let's talk about him.
Yeah, so let's go and bring up our next Nobel Prize winning economist here. See if the magic slide's gonna appear. Excellent. Now, before we get to Oliver, we're gonna stop on a different Oliver. This is Oliver Williamson. And I want to talk about, again, building on transaction cost economics from Coase, but also the concept of hybrid contracts. So what Williamson shows, again, building on Coase's work, is that organizations think in terms of a make or buy, right? Oh, I'm going to partner with you. Just go show up and do this work, right? Or I'm going to outsource, show up and do this work. And so what he says is that when we make that buy decision to work with someone else other than ourselves, we use the market. And you talked about that, Dave, right? The competition and the race to the bottom. And what he says is there's a whole playground in the middle, and he called these hybrid relationships. And so this is what vested is. It's a hybrid relationship. So it's, yes, I'm going to use the market. I'm going to work with someone other than myself to do to bring the skills that are needed to the problem I'm solving, but I'm going to treat them in a very different way. And let's flip the slide because there's two lessons. Oliver Williamson's so cool. He gets two slides. So the next one is about style. And I love this quote from one of his articles. He talks about using a credible style. Muscular buyers not only use their suppliers, they often use up their suppliers and discard them. The muscular approach to outsourcing goods and services is myopic and efficient. Now, this quote is around suppliers and outsourcing, but it really relates to any kind of partnership, right? Think about husband-wife. I'm muscular, right? Well, that doesn't work at home either, right? Or employees. You know, I'm the boss, you're the employee. It doesn't work in an employee environment either. And so what he says is we need to use a credible style. And this is where we parlay that into our work with Oliver Hart on formal relational contracts. The relationship does matter. So we need to choose these high, not all of our things. Remember, P&G has 80,000 suppliers, right? But the ones that really can create value, we need to move into these hybrid type relationships and put the relationship front and center and check our power at the door. Check our muscles at the door.
Yeah, in other words, starting the conversation with, with the statement of a goal that's mutually beneficial and credibly attainable for both. Do go on to Oliver Hart.
Yeah, because these really parlay nicely. So Oliver Hart, I love all these economists, but I really love Oliver Hart because I had the opportunity to do some direct research with him and work. He's one of the co-authors in the Harvard Business Review article, A New Approach to Contracts. And it's interesting how our paths came together because I was working at the University of Tennessee on the practice side of vested relationships. And he was working on the economic theory side of these relationships. And so it was actually an attorney, David Friedlinger, a Swedish attorney, who brought us together. And David, Oliver went over to, true story, Oliver goes over to pick up his Nobel Prize in Stockholm. Well, David's in Stockholm. He invites Oliver to come and give a talk at his law firm. And they began to chat, and all the more Oliver learned about the work that I was doing, and David was working with me on this, on the practicing side. David became that bridge, and it birthed out this article on A New Approach to Contract, which then birthed out the book, Contracting in the New Economy. And what we did in the HBR article is put a real, kind of stake in the ground and said that contracts, the majority of contracts today are transactional. So even if we say we have a strategic relationship, you pick up that contract and it is transactional. So it's a trap that we fall into, right? Your paper, my paper, standard terms and conditions. And so we have these, smart people on the back of a napkin craft these brilliant ideas. And then it goes through the procurement process and it goes through the contracting process. And I leak all of this value, potential value out. And so what we said is, we should have formal relational contracts. Now, the idea of a relational contract was not new. actually had been studied since about the 1960s. Ian McNeill, Stuart Macaulay are two really famous legal scholars who studied relational contracts. But up until when we kind of put that stake in the ground that relational contracts should be formal, the relational contracting components were always outside of the contract. Here's the contract, and then go build that good business relationship.
Yeah.
And what we did is we merged those together. And this is something that we were doing at the University of Tennessee since 2010. And really saying, well, if the relationship's what makes a difference, why aren't we actually embracing that? And we found that some organizations would put the relational constructs in the contract, some wouldn't.
How do you do that? How do you put a relational construct in a contract?
Well, it's fascinating. And this is the whole thing that we teach, which is absolutely amazing. So you remember we talked about having that shared goal, that we think of that as a statement of intent, right? So your formal goal and objectives, what are the 5 things we call those desired outcomes? What's your shared vision and your top 5 desired outcomes you're trying to get out of this partnership? And then we overlay behaviors, because remember, our style matters, right? And so we overlay guiding principles. Now, guiding principles are social norms. They've been studied, but for example, reciprocity. Elinor Ostrom also won a Nobel Prize for her work on, one of the things she studied was reciprocity. And so we bring in these social norms and we educate people what these social norms are, these behaviors, why they're good. They start to play around with them in their brain and go, you know what, if I actually did behave this way, we would have a better partnership. And so they write down the guiding principles and how they want to behave with those guiding principles. So that becomes what's known as a statement of intent. That statement of intent is front and center in your contract. So you open up the contract and it says, we enter into this contract with the purpose of shared vision, desired outcomes. And in order to achieve that, we commit to following a set of guiding principles. And so it brings that relationship front and center. Now, we also couple that contract with governance, the relational constructs to help people manage the relationship. So what are the relationship management principles? What are the transformation management principles? If innovation is important, how are we actually going to unlock that? What are the processes that we're going to use? So we have a governance framework that is actually embedded in the contract. And we're committed to not only try to climb, I use the analogy of going to Mount Everest, right? 1 + 1 = 11. You're the climber and I'm the Sherpa. So we're going to Mount Everest. So we're going to commit to climb Mount Everest, and we're going to have the governance constructs to help us manage that. Some of which is, how are we going to use the analytics? When it snows on Mount Everest, we're going to take the time, transparently look at the data and see what our next step is going to be. Because sometimes our next step is to hunker down in our tent for 3 days. Sometimes it's like, all right, are we sure we're going to go? We're going to go, right? Do we have enough food? So you want to have that transparency of the data. You want to use that in your governance.
I was actually, one of the questions that I wanted to ask you about was how to measure I don't know what the right phrase is, the goodness, how to measure the fairness of a relationship. And I think that's what you're talking about now. Yeah.
Well, we want to measure 3 components of a relationship. We call these the 3D types of metrics. So we want to measure the operations. So are we doing what we've said we're going to do? So if we're going to climb Mount Everest, are we climbing Mount Everest, right? So the operational component, the transformational component, and the relationship component. So remember that compatibility and trust assessment, that's going to measure our relationship health. So we're measuring for today, we're measuring for tomorrow, and we're measuring our relationship health. 3 dimensions of our metrics. And when you look at contracts and relationships today, they almost always measure for today. And that's a miss. They want innovation, and all their metrics are about the transaction. They're not measuring the relationship health, and they're not measuring their ability in that partnership to transform. And why did we go into a strategic partnership? To actually be better, faster, cheaper, safer, right? That's why we do it. It's not just to have a transaction.
Yeah. Yeah. I have done so much of the question asking. I want to just say to the audience, if there are questions, I'd love to see them. Oh, Jane's got one that she's taken off LinkedIn that she's dropped in. Hey, we did it, right? We did all 5.
That's right. We did. I could go into more, but those are 5. I mean, just applying some of these concepts, style matters.
No, the question, since we've done all 5, the question, Kate, is when are you going to get your Nobel Prize?
Well, I'm not a mathematician. I'm a supply chain junkie. And, to win a Nobel Prize in economics, I guess I could win the Peace Prize. I don't know. Can we get a business partnership that's going to solve world hunger? But I'm not a mathematician, so I don't hold a stake. I can't even remotely compete with, or produce I don't even try to compete with these guys, right? But it's really interesting. And I think the way I measure the success of what we're doing is through the traction that we get with real companies driving real change in their organizations. It makes me happy to have a Harvard Business Review article, and it shares the success of these companies. We've got, the book P&G, McDonald's, and Microsoft, and how they're redefining winning in business relationships. I hope that inspires people to actually change for the better.
Jane dropped a question in. What are some immediate actions businesses can take? I'm going to refine that further and say, if people listening to you today, if there's one thing that they should go back to their business with as an action item, what would you recommend that should be? One thing.
Well, I think the transparency commitment matrix is a no-brainer. It's I could say style matters, change your behaviors. I could say, go back and look at all of your partners and which ones really are strategic versus transactions. But if you want something tactical, get a piece of paper out, do a virtual whiteboard, and have a conversation with your partner on what should you be more transparent about. Because the data, if information is power, information shared is exponential power. And so I would want people to lean into these strategic partnerships and just say, how can we be more transparent?
Yeah. Well, look, if the research that I see is right, companies like IDC, Canalys, others, they anticipate that over the next decade, at least 3/4, if not more, of spending will flow through an ecosystem of partners. And so I see nothing but a rosy future ahead for the concept of going to market with and through partners. And I'm excited to keep moving ahead with some of these dialogues with you. Why don't you give us your kind of wrap up comment? Give me a good summary statement.
Well, I actually do agree with you about in the future, the trend is, and it has been for many years, Peter Drucker said, do what you do best and outsource the rest, sell the mailroom. And the problem is, the challenge is that people sold the mailroom. They began to outsource. They started these partnership programs, and they have in theory, it works really great, but in practice, they're not applying good practices. They've fallen into a transactional treadmill. And so my number one piece of advice is be open to new ideas. So go read some of the work that we have. It's all of our white papers, all of our case studies are in the Creative Commons. I referenced public case studies, Dell, BP, Island Health. Those are all out there. Now be inspired to maybe think a little bit different about these strategic partnerships. And not everyone can be a strategic partner. P&G has 80,000 suppliers. Lord, a lot of those need to be transactional. And so think about your ecosystem, segment them out, which ones should be strategic and hybrid relationships, vested relationships, which ones should be transactional. And on those truly strategic relationships, sharpen your skill. Let's come back to school. I love the idea, Dave, about in a future one of these webinars, just talking about the 5 rules.
Yeah.
And I would challenge people on that webinar. We have a diagnostic tool. And so as we're doing it, let's do a little diagnostic and self-diagnose a relationship. And if you think it should be strategic and it's not, well, get to work. Go back to school. Come
Yeah.
to the academy and learn more.
Let's let's get that slide up that has some of the contact information on it, just because I want people to be able to capture that. Kate Vitasek, awesome, love it, great dialogue, great conversation. Really looking forward to book number 8 coming out soon. Again, I'm Dave Taylor. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at a company called Impartner. If you don't know us, check us out, impartner.com. And Kate's contact information is on the slide here. If you have questions or anything you'd like to follow through with, please don't hesitate to reach out. And we'll call that a wrap. Kate, thanks for your time today.
Well, thanks for having me. And I hope that we've inspired some folks with some big ideas that we can, they can take and begin to trickle down into their organizations.
Good. It's all about the partnering. It's all about mutual success. We love mutual success. All right. Thanks, everybody, for your time today. We wish you all the best. Have a great end of the year, and we'll catch up with you either later this year or early next. We appreciate all your time today. Thank you.